Good afternoon, evening, morning, whenever you're watching this, colleagues. I just want to take a second out here to discuss our topic for the week regarding Neustadt's idea of presidential weakness and if it still applies to 21st century presidency, more specifically getting into Skowronek's idea that Neustadt's model was only meant for mid-century presidents and doesn't have a lot of undercurrent for 21st century presidencies. I'm going to say it does, and really some of the confusion might result from an overemphasis on public prestige that we find in the 21st century, but the components of presidential power that Neustadt discusses are still relevant today. So first off, we want to look at the idea of presidential weakness. I'm going to look at it from 2 points here. First is Tocqueville's idea of presidential weakness. For Tocqueville, the one thing I picked up on is this idea of circumstances, not law, not formal powers, really constrain and limit a president's effectiveness. Essentially, this idea of he can't create law. He's only obligated to enforce them. Tocqueville looks at the French monarch, the French king, compared to the presidency, and the French monarch certainly played a role in the creation of law, and that's a great power in regards to government, whereas our president is really, at least for Tocqueville, didn't play a huge role in the policy process. He was just there to enforce, to administer law. Neustadt really picks up on this idea of presidential weakness is because of dependency, things outside, circumstances, institutional circumstances, and even to a certain extent the events that confine his presidency create this weakness, whether it's the fact that legislative power ultimately resides in Congress, and he doesn't have as much power or sway as he thinks over the legislative process, and then ultimately judicial review belonging to the courts. The courts are left to interpret the law. The president's just merely there to enforce it. He might not like a law. He can't necessarily change the meaning of a law. That's really left for the courts to decide what a law, the applicability of a law is. And then finally, looking at his reputation with political actors and the public, Neustadt discusses, and even Dickinson gets into the idea of, Washingtonians versus non-Washingtonians and how those interact and contribute to a president's effectiveness. So looking at components of presidential power very quickly, there were 3 that were identified in Dickinson's article. Professional reputation, essentially his job competency. Is he viewed as a competent administrator? And that affects how Congress supports a president. Washingtonians' opinions of him. If a president is viewed in a certain way, whether favorably or prone to act in certain areas, kind of what is his red line, that will certainly inform how legislators act and pass legislation and react to the threat of presidential veto. His public prestige. What is the public opinion of the president? Certainly, public opinion can help a president out, and he certainly will go on the campaign a lot to appeal to the outsiders. We hear that a lot in campaigns today, the idea of, I'm not a Beltway insider, I'm an outsider going in to change things. In the words of President Trump, to drain the swamp. The president uses his prestige to affect policy outcomes. And then his persuasive power, convincing people to act, really evidenced by his ability to sway public policy into his favor and into his advantage. Now, understanding this idea of circumstances and weakness seemed to kind of go in hand with this week's readings. But Neustadt refers to, in his introduction to presidential power, this idea of the power problem. And presidents have to know not only when to enhance their power, but to conserve their personal power, when to use it, when not to use it, because really what they need to take into consideration is this idea of effectiveness. Will their decision be effective now? Will it be effective in the future? And it gets into what Dickinson refers to when he's talking about Neustadt, this bargaining power idea in the presidency. In theory, a president will balance these different components to be effective, to leverage the different pieces against each other to achieve ideal policy outcomes. Now, limits to the bargaining model, and this is where Skowronek comes in. Presidents shouldn't be measured by how they gain personal advantage. They should be measured on how they reshape the political context to their advantage. Now, looking at the era of public prestige, which we get into in a second, the stability of Neustadt's model, again, going back to Skowronek, he challenges it, saying essentially they need to be viewed by their effectiveness in rechanging and reshaping the landscape. However, Neustadt really says, despite his model being used on mid-century presidents, his model still effectively remains the same. And I would probably agree with him on this aspect. In what might cause some confusion for people is there's been so much focus on the public prestige of the presidency in recent presidencies, specifically beginning with Bush, Obama, and now President Trump, is this idea of this endless presidential campaign. I read a Washington Post article that got into, it was addressing criticisms of Trump for returning and campaigning immediately following his presidency, going to key swing states, and almost campaigning for re-election. But really beginning with George H.W. Bush, you saw a rise in the number of appearances presidents were making and going out and stumping and campaigning following their installation in offices. And really this begins this era of what's the permanent campaign, where presidents are always campaigning and going forward and trying to appeal to the people. And it fits well with this prophecy of de Tocqueville, that I like to bring up. He refers to this idea of re-election. Essentially, the election becomes the sole matter that preoccupies the minds. He no longer governs in the interests of states, but in that of his re-election. So the question for me becomes now is, because the 21st century presidencies seem to be focusing on only one component of presidential power, this area of public prestige, and what that has done is really compromised their professional reputation, their ability to work with Washingtonians to achieve policy goals and to administer the government effectively. Look at our 21st century presidencies and their administrative failures, because they're overemphasizing on these public prestige, going out and constantly campaigning. In essence, they're sacrificing their administrative effectiveness. Bush presidency, his intelligence failures in the Iraq War were one of his biggest criticisms in office. Also, look at Hurricane Katrina and the administrative miscues and failures that occurred between FEMA level administrators and state and local authorities in Louisiana. Examining the presidency of Barack Obama, even President Obama admitted in Time magazine, one of the biggest mistakes for him was not understanding what would happen in the wake of Gaddafi's removal from power, and that ultimately led to errors in Benghazi. And the Hill.com identified for them one of their biggest problems with the Obama presidency was his failure to correct problems in the Veterans Affairs Administration. Despite his claims to fix it, they claimed he left the administration worse off than when he took office. And the Trump presidency today, now granted these aren't necessarily backed up per se, however, they're in the news a lot, is you look at the Trump presidency from an administrative failure aspect, there's a seeming revolving door of the White House office where officials are constantly being let go and coming in and being let go again, and there's no real stability in his office. And then also the word vomit on Twitter is something I like to bring up. His constant going out and appealing directly to the people because he doesn't trust media outlets to do it is hurting his credibility and his professional reputation. So ultimately, all of this still matters. Neustadt's model is still applicable. It's just skewed by the fact that we're focused on public prestige in the 21st century versus other areas such as a president's professional reputation, which ultimately will affect his ability to persuade and achieve policy outcomes to his benefit.